For Monty Smith, no woman will ever come close to his first love.
Tabitha, she was beautiful. Always had her makeup done, her hair is always perfect, and we just had this bond right away.
Definitely two beautiful people that were attracted to each other. A lot of chemistry.
But one Halloween night, he's bewitched by sexy Shayna Sims.
Someone just kind of grabbed me by my shirt. Dark hair, pretty face.
Shayna didn't have a bad side. You just never knew when it was going to come out or what was going to happen.
And his life becomes a horror show.
It's macabre, it's disturbing, it's reprehensible.
I could not believe what I was hearing. I can't even believe that this is the woman that I'm married to.
It is the most bizarre set of circumstances I've ever covered in 31 years.
I grew up an only child, just me and my mom. She had me at an early age, 19.
In the 1980s, Monty Smith is an only child, growing up in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. His dad is not present in his life, so his mom is everything to Monty.
She was about 5'1", little woman, but she was spicy. Straight to the point with me. She's like, I'm not gonna let you grow up be a bad kid. I'm gonna be telling you what's right and wrong. She was good at that.
He was very close to his mom. That was his rock. I have childhood memories of Monty and I, playing in the backyard while our mothers were inside, doing their thing.
Monty's mother is in ill health for most of his childhood with kidney disease.
My mom was on dialysis for my whole life. 3 days a week, we had to go to the hospital, and for 8 hours of time for her to do dialysis. She was a very strong woman, though. She still, was able to hold a job down, too.
He was going to school. He was at home, making sure his mom had what she needed or they needed. He definitely had to grow up a lot faster than the rest of us.
Whenever Monty gets the chance, he heads to the basketball court with his best friend, Jermaine.
Basketball was a big thing, so we played basketball nonstop. Everybody wanted to be the star player, the most popular.
We always had a ball in our hand. For Monty, it was strictly basketball. He was a very good basketball player.
After graduating from high school, Monty attends college, but he and Jermaine still have time to play ball. This is how they meet Monty's first love, Tabitha Lynch, in 1993.
Tabitha and Monty grew close very quickly. The way that they looked at each other, I could tell that was his first love.
We were a magnet towards each other. I did kind of feel like I, was a lucky guy because we just always had a good time together no matter what we did. There was never any arguing, just had fun all the time.
After dating for 3 years, Monty and Tabitha eventually drift apart.
She was in college playing basketball, and so was I. She was at a different school, so we didn't get to see each other a lot.
I know life happens, but I would have definitely liked to have seen them stay together back in those days. That was definitely the one that got away from Monty.
After college, Monty becomes a mechanic and gets married. But 10 years later, as his mother's health deteriorates, so too does his marriage.
Monty, of course, wanted to be around his mother more, definitely played a role in his relationship with his wife.
After me and my wife had split up, my mother had a stroke. And then there was, just her health just went quickly.
It took a rough toll, and it took a toll on him mentally.
But the day that I found out that she passed, I was on a motorcycle ride out of town. That was a hard moment, and I was crying inside my helmet. Yeah, I felt empty after my mom's gone, I was just trying to get through one day at a time and hide my emotions from everybody, I worked as much as I could. I developed this new passion for motorcycles. So I just, get on my bike and ride when I could. That was my escape.
On Halloween night in 2010, Monty's life begins looking up when he attends a party at a local club.
So we walk in, there was a lot of good costumes there. I was standing there and someone just kind of grabbed me by my shirt, and before I can get a chance to see what was happening, I was being pulled onto the dance floor and then never even faced me. She's just looking the other way and dancing with me. I didn't know what to think about her at first. I was like, that's kind of aggressive approach right there. So then that song was over and I walked over to the stand by the bar area, and then she came with me. I said, my name's Monty. And she said, oh, my name's Shayna.
Shayna Sims is a 22-year-old hairstylist.
She was about the same height as me, and that's kind of tall for a woman. She had dark hair, pretty face. There we just kept talking. She stayed by my side for the rest of the night. That was a nice feeling to have a pretty girl like that interested in me, because I was kind of feeling down on myself a little bit, right before that happened. We went back to her house. I spent the night there with her the first night, just talking and hanging out till the sun came up.
The relationship moves quickly, and a few months later, in January 2011, they move in together.
It was never a dull moment, I'll say that. We had fun, did a lot of things together.
I remember him being excited when he told me that he had met Shayna and how he lit up when he talked about Shayna originally.
The next thing I know, we started talking about, well, maybe we should get married.
Just a few weeks later, Monty surprises Shayna with a ring.
So we're at dinner. I waited for the right moment, and then I got down on one knee. I asked her, to marry me, and she said yes. I put the ring on her finger. She just was very excited and happy.
He was all in on this relationship, and this is what he wanted. She seemed to be feeling the same way, so I was very supportive.
We had decided to get married at the Tulsa Historical Society. She did all the prep work herself, which I was kind of amazed by that. I was really nervous, but from the moment that I seen her come out and I seen that smile on her face, it felt right. Everybody was encouraging to us. It was a great day.
He wanted to be the husband and the father and the family man that he never had. So he very much looked forward to that.
I had came home from work one day and she had this smile on her face. And I'm like, what are you smiling about? So I think I remember her saying, come here, I want to show you something. So she showed me the pregnancy test. It showed positive and I felt happy, excited to be a dad.
As an expectant father, Monty is fully invested in Shayna having a healthy pregnancy. So he is surprised and concerned one day when he becomes aware of a potential problem.
We had a doctor's appointment, just normal routine. The doctors came into the room and told us they did not support my mother taking pain medication during pregnancy.
Shayna, who had been complaining of leg pain, has been self-medicating for months with Percocet and Lortabs, both highly addictive opioids.
She went to a pain specialist doctor, and I was unaware of this. So I was at work at this time, so I'm pretty sure that she did not tell them that she was pregnant, and they proceeded to help her with her pain level.
Her obstetrician has become aware of Shayna's drug use through routine lab tests.
They could not help her anymore, that she needed to look for another doctor to help deliver her baby. I was furious. I can't believe that you could endanger your child like that. I found the medication in her purse, confronted her. I said, you're not taking any more of these right now because I'm taking them from you. So you can't have these anymore.
Monty's daughter is born 6 months later.
She came out She heard my voice and stopped crying and opened her eyes and looked for me. At that moment, our bond was created. She's healthy, no problems whatsoever. I was very happy about that, and that the things that her mom had done early on did not affect her. Shayna seemed happy to be a new mom again to this pretty little girl. At that point, we had a good relationship pretty much. After my daughter was just a few months old, I switched to night shift on my job. So 3 in the evenings till midnight, working hard to provide as much as I can for my family since I'm the only one working right now.
While Monty works, he believes his baby daughter is tucked safely in bed during his shift. But he is wrong.
I would come home at midnight. I would notice that she's just getting home right when I am and bringing my daughter in the house, out of the car seat. She hadn't been home all evening long. She just said, I'm out running errands. It's okay. She said, I don't see anything wrong with that. I told her that she shouldn't be out with my daughter all evening long, that she needed to be home in the bed. I started to become more aggravated. We had a lot of arguments.
One night, Monty arrives home to find Shayna in bed, although she's not quite alone.
She's passed out. Her phone is laying face up on the bed and is on FaceTime with some other young man that I do not know. Couldn't believe it.
And I started seeing the signs from Shayna that maybe she wasn't the person that she's seeming to be. She became very evil very quickly.
Monty Smith has just found his wife Shayna in bed and on FaceTime with another man.
I look at the phone, she's passed out, unaware that I'm even right there looking at her phone. No clue. A lot of things went through my mind. But number one was, how could you? My daughter's right there in the other room. The next day, I brought it up and talked to her about it. And she said, well, I don't remember that. Denial.
Monty did mention a lot that Shayna would just lie about nothing, lie to be lying.
I was pretty upset, pretty angry. At this point, the trust is gone.
When I hear these things, myself, I'm thinking, Monty, you got to do something about this before it gets worse.
And indeed, things do get worse.
One day we have an argument. She's, not letting me go out the door. I said, I have to go to work. Excuse me, move out of my way. And then she says, no, you're not going to touch me. If you do, you're going to go to jail. And I said, what do you mean by that?
This is when Shayna reveals just how low she will sink to get her own way.
She's like, well, because you're black. And they're going to take you to jail before they with me. After her saying that to me, I was really, really done. And I wanted to just leave.
They do have a daughter together. That was the main reason for Monty wanting to stay. He wanted to not have a broken home. So he made his decisions to stay.
Soon, Shayna's erratic behavior escalates outside the home.
Monty had taken Shayna to go tan. He stayed outside in the car with the baby.
Unbeknownst to Monty, while inside, Shayna overreacts to something trivial and flies off the handle.
While he was sitting in the car with the baby, 2 police cars pulled up outside the tanning salon. He said, hey man, I think something's happening. And yeah, she was having a scene inside the tanning salon, ended up, cursing out some ladies that worked there and may call the cops, and, they eventually, kicked her out. It was at that point I told him, I said, hey man, I love you, brother, but you need to figure this out.
I had friends that I had confided in about my problems at home. They just kind of let me know how messed up the situation was that I was in and what am I going to do next.
Around November 2014, An ex-girlfriend reaches out to Monty on social media. Her name is Christina Perez.
We had said hello to each other on Facebook. I think she may have asked, what my situation was, and probably told her, I was unhappy.
Monty and Christina do not meet in person, but continue to chat occasionally online until Shayna finds out.
So I came home from work one day, and Shayna asked me who this Christina girl was, and I was like, oh gosh, here we go.
Shayna thought that Christina was the enemy and was trying to take her man.
She was mad about this situation that she thought was going on, so I am accused of having an affair with Christina.
The situation escalates when Shayna tracks down Christina's home and her place of work.
She's showing up at Christina's job, sitting outside, and it's getting more and more aggressive, their tone every day.
And then it blew up from there.
One day, when I got home from work, they were talking to each other, and I could hear Christina on speakerphone saying, I know what you did to my car, and I'm calling the police. Shayna had slashed Christina's tires. I'm blown away. I'm thinking to myself, who is this person?
She was slashing this woman's tires. She was following this woman. She was doing all these crazy things to this woman who had dated her husband 5 years ago.
I couldn't believe it. It first started out, with Shayna acting out in public and then escalating to slashing someone's tires. What's next? At that point, I knew that Shayna was crazy.
After the tire slashing, it's just getting worse and worse each day. They're making threats towards each other at this point.
Christina doesn't retaliate, and Monty stops contacting her. But things come to a head when Shayna decides to file a protective order against Christina.
We go to the courthouse. I'm with her, me and my daughter. We're sitting in the lobby just waiting. I looked down the hallway and saw Christina.
By chance, Christina is at the courthouse as well to file a protective order against Shayna.
And of course, they gave each other mean looks. And the next thing I know, they're walking towards each other. And my wife is holding my daughter. And they wanted to exchange words with each other. And then they swung at each other. As soon as they throw punches at each other, I'm grabbing my daughter out of harm's way. My daughter's crying. It was quite intense. The deputies came out and separated everybody. They took them back in the holding areas until they figure out what happened.
And thank goodness there was tape. So the deputies pull it, and of course they see Christina is innocent, that Shayna has purposefully knocked into this woman and then starts screaming about Christina attacking her.
They realized that the child had been endangered in this encounter. So my wife was charged with child endangerment.
Shayna is put on probation for a year, and Christina is granted a protective order against her.
I did feel trapped in this, I'm not gonna call it a marriage anymore. I felt trapped in this situation. But because my daughter's involved in this, and I can't just take off.
Monty doesn't hear from Christina again. Meantime, out of the blue, a few months later, Monty gets a message from another girlfriend from his past, Tabitha Lynch, his first love.
She had contacted me through Facebook and said, hey, how's it going? We chatted a little bit and then exchanged a number to talk. Her contacting me was kind of like a breath of fresh air. It was nice to hear from her and, see how she was doing in her life.
It's been over 20 years since Monty and Tabitha dated each other. Tabitha is divorced with 2 children of her own.
I didn't know all the details going on in her life at this time, but she just, told me that she had kids and they were doing good. And once she found out that I was having problems with my wife, she's like, I'd like to reach out to her and talk to her. I just didn't think it was a good idea. I didn't know what to expect from Shayna. I was like, no, it's okay. I got this under control. I'm gonna handle it my way. But one day after returning home from work, I walked to the door, and Shayna was upset. She's like, Tabitha has reached out to me and said that you and her have been talking and that I'm a terrible mom and a terrible wife. And so she asked me, who's this bitch?
Shayna was very angry because she felt that Tabitha was a threat.
She can't stop victimizing people. I would say she is one of the most bizarre people I've ever covered in 31 years of covering crime.
Shayna was very jealous, very vindictive, very evil.
Shayna Smith is enraged when she receives a warning message from her husband Monty's former girlfriend, Tabitha Lynch.
Tabitha did send a message to Shayna, basically telling her that, you know, she's losing the best thing that she could ever have, and she needs to change her ways before she screws it up.
Shayna took that as disrespect and did not like what she heard because it's coming from another woman. And she asked me, are y'all messing around? And I said, no.
Shayna is determined to have it out with Tabitha face to face, but she can't seem to locate her.
She's constantly asking me where to find her at. I said, I don't know. I was kind of worried about these two women having the interaction with each other because I don't know what Shayna's capable of.
But Shayna never gets the chance to confront Tabitha because one day, Tabitha suddenly becomes critically ill.
Tabitha had started having some health issues, and eventually she went into the hospital and didn't make it out.
2 months after reconnecting with Monty, Tabitha dies unexpectedly from natural causes.
Tabitha was like a sister to me, so it hurt me deeply.
I was like, I can't believe it. It seemed like I just talked to her just the other day and everything was fine.
Monty consoles himself that at least she's out of harm's way from Shayna.
I told Shayna that Tabitha passed away. She acted cold and heartless. She didn't care. The next words out of her mouth were, oh good, that's what that bitch gets. My jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe it. I just heard her say that about Tabitha's death. I was already emotionally removed. I was ready to be physically removed. I didn't want to know her anymore.
The viewing for Tabitha Lynch is held in April of 2015 at a funeral chapel in East Tulsa.
I was there Thursday afternoon, probably between 1 and 2 o'clock. It hurt my heart. It was like a member of my family had passed away.
As the viewing ends, the family is taking a break outside when a stranger slips inside, presumably to pay her last respects.
Tabitha's mother happens to see this woman who looks like she's going and actually reaching into the casket. Something seems odd. It's reported to other family members. That woman is now gone, but the family goes to inspect Tabitha's body, and clearly her body has been touched. She's got a straight, cut right from the top of her head, right close to the bridge of her nose.
Her hair's been cut, and then her pants have been pulled down, her outfit has been pulled down. Her shoes that were specially made just for her that were in her casket, they're now gone. Everybody, they're just in shock. You realize that some crazy woman has come in here and desecrated this body.
Here you've got just absolute pandemonium unfolding. It's just, you can't put into words how devastating that was for this victim's family to just see.
There is one thing that we always hold sacred in this country, and that is how you treat a person who's passed away. And this just violated every tenet of that for sure.
Tabitha's family place a call to the police.
This is never a call you ever get, ever. And it just gets crazier from there.
And so the officers at that time, when they got there, they see Tabitha, they see a disheveled body lying in a casket. They see that the makeup is messed up. They see that the incision on her face. And those are all really unusual things. Those are things that should not have happened and that the officers were shocked to see. It feels like the crime was a personal attack on this person. They start taking photographs. They start collecting evidence, looking around, looking at the body, making observations.
And down next to the casket, there's hair. Tabitha's hair has been cut, and there's some of the hair laying on the ground.
While police are processing the crime scene at the funeral home, another call is placed to dispatch from Tabitha's family, who are now at her apartment.
They learned that the suspect may possibly be at the apartment.
They're reporting, we think this person who was just down at the funeral home is over at our house, and we need to get somebody over here right now.
Hours earlier, Monty Smith receives a disturbing message from Shayna.
I opened it up and looked at it, and it was a picture of Tabitha in her casket. I was very shocked to see her with this picture. I didn't understand why. Why do you have this picture? You know, where did you get this from? And then she also said, that bitch looks ugly in her casket. I can't believe you're messing with her. I was confused. I didn't know what she meant by that.
Once Monty finds out what Shayna has done, his life will never be the same.
It's beyond me, why she would do what she did.
I've seen a lot of strange cases in my 31 years, and this one takes the cake. So many twists and turns along the way, and then it became frightening and more bizarre. It just became crazy.
After receiving the pictures from Shayna, Monty Smith returns home to find her in a frenzied state.
Shayna says, take your daughter out of the car and grab her car seat too. After I took my daughter out, she drove off. That left me and my daughter sitting there. This was probably about 5:30 in the evening. Had no clue where she was going.
It's 7:30 p.m. when police arrive at Tabitha's apartment.
They meet a bunch of Tabitha's family outside in the parking lot. And at that point, Tabitha's family tells them, there's someone inside our apartment and we didn't invite her in.
It's a heightened level of tension for the family members. It's like she's inside.
They learned that this woman had showed up at the door of Tabitha Lynch's apartment. She says, my name's Stephanie, and I'm here because something happened to your mother's makeup at the funeral home.
The woman claims she wanted a photo of Tabitha in order to fix her makeup.
And so she makes up this ruse to get inside the apartment, and at some point, the family kind of gets suspicious. So the police go inside the apartment, and what they find is this disheveled, jittery-looking woman who appears out of place. She doesn't seem like she belongs there.
Police search the suspect and discover incriminating evidence.
They find a knife and a box cutter in her pockets. They find some hair in her pocket. And so it was apparent to them at that point that this person was related to what had happened at the funeral home. A few of the family members recognized this girl who identified herself as Stephanie as actually Shayna Sims. And when they start talking to police officers, they tell them that Shayna is actually the wife of Monty Smith, and Monty is a longtime friend of Tabitha Lynch.
Monty is putting his daughter to bed when his phone rings.
It was Shayna. Her voice was shaky. She's telling me, come save her. Then the next thing, I heard voices in the background, and she was telling them to stop and let her go. And they said, no, you're not going anywhere. And I was like, who's that in the background? What are you talking about? And she said, I'm at your dead bitch's house. You can't be. What do you mean? So I got my daughter up and I drove to Tabitha's home. As I'm driving over there, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what all just happened. And then once I arrived there, it was already chaos at that point. They have Shayna in the police car. As soon as they open the car door, she's trying to tell me that she's being accused of messing with Tabitha's body, and that they're saying that she's, stole some stuff from them. She did not. That's why I told them to close the door. I didn't want to hear anymore.
Police believe Shayna wanted to break into Tabitha's apartment to steal a personal item she could keep as a trophy. The next day, the Tulsa media seizes on the story.
We immediately went to the scene to try to figure out what on earth was happening. And just what we learned that day, nobody in their right mind would go into a funeral home and do these terrible things to someone who's already passed away. Because what threat are they at that point?
Shayna's act of desecration is so unusual that police are hard-pressed to find the correct laws with which to charge her.
They initially charged her with burglary because she had entered the apartment under false pretenses. They charged her with illegal dissection because that was essentially the closest thing they could find to coming up with that cut on Tabitha's face.
They told me what she was being charged with, and I'm blown away. 100% total shock.
That is a whole new level of crazy. It's way beyond anything that I could ever imagine someone doing.
It seems impossible, but things actually get crazier.
My sergeant came in and said, "Hey, I got a message from the funeral home that we need to go out and take a look at the body again." I grabbed one of my detective partners and my sergeant, and we went out there. So when we examined the body, we found that Tabitha's breasts had been crudely cut out of her body. We also noticed that one of her toes was missing. I had, at that point, worked hundreds of homicides as a crime scene detective, and I had not ever seen anything like this.
The investigators talk with Monty, who shows them the photographs that Shayna had texted him the previous day. They are the equivalent of a smoking gun.
So I see a hand holding a knife next to a toe. I recognize that as probably Tabitha's foot. And I see there's photographs of a hand next to what I assume to be Tabitha's genitalia. And I realize that I'm looking at photographs of Shayna in the act, committing these heinous acts at the funeral home.
I was disturbed, kind of, heartbroken. Couldn't believe that she did this to someone that I knew and that had passed away. A total disrespect.
How are you going to explain those photos? I mean, that just kind of seals her fate. Pictures of what she's actually doing.
When the case goes to trial in April 2016, Shayna is charged with 3 misdemeanors and 2 felonies.
A woman accused of slashing the body of her husband's former girlfriend is expected in court today.
This is a case that is revenge. This is the ex getting involved with her husband, and so she's going to do something about that.
I don't remember any emotion from Shayna. The defense had tried very early on in the process to say she wasn't competent to stand trial because she's got, mental issues, but she was given a thorough exam. That was part of her pre-trial process, and she was found competent to stand trial. The defense were like, look, she's just a woman pushed over the edge like any woman would be. Her husband's having an affair, the victim is texting her and rubbing her face in it. What else would a woman do?
The prosecution call a number of witnesses, including Monty.
Seeing Shayna in the courtroom and being asked questions, and she's staring at me, trying to intimidate me. I answer the questions and try to get through it.
And then the jury goes out. It's right before lunchtime. It's like 11:45 in the morning. And I didn't think it would take too long. So 3 hours later, almost to the minute, they called us back in the courtroom, and that's when the verdict was read.
They found her guilty of all the counts. All those counts were ordered to run consecutive. It all totaled up to 16 total years.
I guess you could say I felt a kind of peace.
Monty divorces Shayna a year later and gets full custody of their daughter.
I can't imagine, what he had to go through, what he had to tell his daughter, all the ramifications of that. That's tough.
Less than 4 years into Shayna's sentence, a new law is struck in Oklahoma that gives her a loophole to appeal.
Shayna Sims has been released from prison after serving 4 years of her sentence.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. I couldn't believe it. I was in shock.
It was just a gut punch to everybody.
It was devastating to me when I found out. I felt rage at that point. I couldn't believe it.
In November 2021, Monty Smith's ex-wife Shayna Sims is set free, less than 4 years into a 16-year sentence for desecrating Tabitha Lynch's body.
I was like, she can't be. There's no way. But sure enough, I did get confirmation message later that day that she was released. I actually saw a video of her being released.
She just gets to walk. She spends a few years in prison for all the damage she's caused, and she gets to walk.
You couldn't ask for a more devastating blow to the victim's family.
It was a shock. It was really a kick in the gut that we learned that she was going to be walking free after we put this case together. To have someone walking free was tough to swallow.
Shayna has been released on appeal as a result of a Supreme Court ruling known as the McGirt decision.
The McGirt decision, in essence, basically told Oklahoma if somebody was a Native American, either as a defendant or as a victim, that the state of Oklahoma had no jurisdiction to handle those prosecutions.
The United States Supreme Court said that the state of Oklahoma can't arrest Native Americans, our prosecutors can't prosecute crimes involving Native Americans, and so that brought into question thousands and thousands of cases over the years where a Native American was either a victim or a suspect.
This new law is supposed to protect Native Americans.
But what did Shayna Sims do? She figured out that Tabitha had Native American blood in her. You can't prosecute me for this crime. And literally, she got her case dismissed because of that McGirt decision. Shayna Sims, somebody has zero Native American blood in her, gets the benefit of victimizing somebody who was a Native American and walks around as though she's got no consequences. It's just so upsetting.
Once Shayna is out of jail, she can't seem to stay out of trouble.
Monty was worried about what she might do. Of course, the victim's family, Tabitha's family, was really worried and stressed about what she might do or who she might target. She gets arrested for stealing a car, then gets in trouble for assaulting her mother. It's just one thing after another. Monty's big concern was protecting his daughter, because now that she's free, what would stop her from trying to get custody?
I got a phone call from Shayna wanting to speak with her daughter. I did not know, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. I ignored it for the first few days. She kept calling.
He didn't know what her plans were or what she was capable of doing now that she's out of jail.
Monty talks with their daughter, who tells him she wants to meet her mother. He drops her off for a weekend at her grandmother's house, where Shayna is staying.
Thought to myself, give it a try just one time and see how it goes. Shayna and her mom, they were yelling at each other and having confrontation in front of my daughter when she's not used to seeing that. And she told me herself that she didn't want to be around that, and she didn't want to see them. So I did not force her at that point to go back anymore. And that's where we are to this current day.
Monty still has full custody of his daughter. So yes, he, was doing his best to keep his daughter safe, to keep Shayna away.
Despite being warned about not going anywhere near Tabitha's relatives, Shayna defies the order.
And then, sure enough, Shayna then goes to the victim's family's apartment, and she's like, oh, I wasn't there to see them, which is a lie. You're only there to harass that poor family who's already been through so much. All you have to do to stay out of jail is stay over in your county. But she can't help herself again. She comes over here, and of course, that puts the family in terror. They are afraid of why she keeps showing up there and what she might do. And so, of course, yes, she's arrested and put back in.
Recognizing that Shayna is still a threat, Oklahoma state prosecutors file an appeal.
We had another case. It was called Castro Huerta, which was somebody who was clearly not a Native American, who had victimized children who were Native American. And we took that fact pattern back up to the United States Supreme Court and asked them to revisit, in essence, the McGirt decision. So then we immediately took that decision, petitioned the court, got her dismissal set aside, and remanded Shayna Sims back to prison, which is where she's at today.
In February 2023, Shayna's sentence and conviction are reinstated, and she is sent back to prison to serve the remaining 12 years.
So it's definitely a relief, for all of us that she's back in jail. Me personally, I don't think 16 years is long enough.
I'm at peace in my life. My daughter's at peace. She's happy. I've never let this be a problem for her.
Monty has this smile that whenever he's in good spirits, and it shows. He just glows. And I love to see my brother when he's happy and when everything is going good.
I feel like after all this is said and done, it's like looking at the damage after a tornado or after a disaster, and how are you gonna put your life back together after this?
I don't know of any person that could have withstanded what he had to go through, especially these past 6 or 7 years, but he didn't. So I'll always love him for that.
I'm still in the stages of putting my life back together and moving forward. But it's built me to be a stronger person and better dad.
The street was still wet from a late summer rain when the night swallowed her whole, a narrow ribbon of asphalt in South London reflecting the orange glow of sodium lamps, the kind of ordinary street where nothing ever makes the papers until something does, and years later people swear the air changed that night, that the silence learned a new shape, because at 10:42 p.m. a woman stepped out of a bus, adjusted the strap of her handbag, and vanished into history. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, 32 years old, a clerical worker who never missed a shift and never stayed out late, the sort of person whose routines were so predictable that friends joked you could set your watch by her, and that was why her absence hit like a crack of thunder, because predictability is supposed to be a shield, and yet the shield failed without warning. The bus driver remembered her face only because she thanked him as she stepped down, a detail so small it almost didn't survive the night, but it would be written down anyway, ink scratching across a form, the first of thousands of marks that would try and fail to pin this moment in place. By morning, her flat was still locked from the outside, the kettle cold, her shoes lined neatly by the door, and the city did what cities do, kept moving, kept breathing, while a small circle of people stood very still, staring at a reality that refused to make sense. Police called it a missing person at first, a routine classification that carried no drama, no sirens, no headlines, just a file number and a checklist, because people disappear all the time in London, adults especially, and most come back with excuses that sound thin but prove sufficient. Except Eleanor didn't come back. Her bank account stayed untouched. Her workplace chair stayed empty. Her sister rang every hospital, every shelter, every friend, her voice growing hoarse as hope wore down into something sharper and more desperate. The first 48 hours slipped away, then the third day, then a week, and the word routine quietly fell out of use. When officers walked the route from the bus stop to Eleanor's flat, they found nothing that wanted to be found, no torn fabric, no dropped keys, no scuffed pavement to suggest a struggle, just a stretch of road flanked by parked cars and brick terraces, a place where someone could disappear without leaving a mark if they knew how, or if they were unlucky enough to cross paths with someone who did. Neighbors remembered hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no raised voices, only the usual soundtrack of a city night, a television through a wall, a car door slamming somewhere down the block, memories that felt solid until they were questioned, until every sound began to blur together. One woman thought she'd seen a man standing near a lamppost. Another recalled a van idling longer than necessary. details offered with uncertainty and withdrawn almost as quickly, because memory under pressure is a treacherous thing. The first headline came on day 9, small and easily missed, a few inches of column space that read, "Woman missing in South London." No photograph, no bold type, just facts stripped of feeling, but within weeks the tone shifted, the language hardened, and the word "cold case" began to hover at the edges, unspoken but heavy, because time was passing and answers were not arriving. Detectives worked the phones until their fingers cramped, traced Eleanor's last known contacts, knocked on doors that opened to confusion or irritation, and closed again with nothing gained. Her colleagues described her as cautious, careful, not the type to hitch a ride or wander off with a stranger, a description that narrowed possibilities without illuminating any of them. Her family clung to that image because it suggested an external force, an interruption, something violent and unjust, and in the absence of evidence, belief became a lifeline. In October, a jogger found a handbag in a patch of scrubland near the railway, leather cracked and damp, the contents scattered as if by a careless hand, and for a moment the investigation jolted back to life, sirens cutting through the air, officers marking off the area with tape that fluttered in the wind. The bag was Eleanor's, confirmed by receipts, by a lipstick worn down to a familiar stub, by the small notebook where she wrote grocery lists in tidy handwriting. But there was no blood, no fingerprints worth keeping, no trace that could be followed beyond that point, just an object divorced from its owner, an answer that raised more questions than it closed. Some said the bag had been planted, others that it had been discarded in panic. Theories bloomed and withered in the same breath because nothing could be proven, and in policing, proof is the only currency that spends. As winter settled in, the case began its long slide toward obscurity, resources diverted, new crimes demanding attention, Eleanor's file inching toward the back of the cabinet, where unsolved cases go to wait. Her sister kept calling, kept pushing, her grief sharpening into anger, because silence feels like abandonment when you're living inside it. Detectives assured her the investigation was ongoing, words that sounded hollow even as they were spoken, because ongoing can mean many things, including stalled, including stuck, including quietly dying. Posters faded on lampposts, the ink bleached by sun and rain until Eleanor's face became a ghost of itself, eyes staring out from paper that peeled and curled at the edges. Years passed. The city changed. Shops closed and reopened under new names. Children who had played on that street grew up and moved away. New residents parked their cars under the same lamppost where someone might once have stood watching. Inside the station, the case file gathered dust, but it was never closed, not officially, because there was no body, no confession, no finality to justify that word. Instead, it lived in a limbo reserved for questions without answers, a cold case in all but name, its temperature dropping with every season that failed to bring resolution. Detectives retired, younger officers took their place, and Eleanor Briggs became a story told during training, a cautionary tale about the limits of certainty. In the late 80s, a tip came in from a man who claimed to have seen Eleanor enter a car that night, a dark saloon with a dented rear bumper, a detail that sent officers rifling through old registration records, chasing a lead that dissolved under scrutiny when timelines failed to align. In the 90s, a convicted offender wrote a letter hinting at involvement, a vague confession that promised closure and delivered nothing, his claims collapsing when checked against known facts. Each false dawn hurt more than the silence, because hope, once raised, falls hard, and Eleanor's family learned to brace themselves against it, to expect disappointment as a form of self-preservation. By the time the new millennium arrived, the case had achieved a strange kind of immortality, resurfacing every few years in anniversary pieces, brief flares of attention that burned out quickly, leaving behind the same unanswered questions. Journalists called it baffling, haunting, a mystery that refused to age, and the language grew more dramatic as the facts remained stubbornly plain. A woman vanished. No witnesses. No body. No arrest. The community still felt the ripple, a low-level unease passed down like folklore, parents warning children, neighbors locking doors a little earlier, the idea taking root that safety was an illusion maintained by habit rather than guarantee. Inside the family, time fractured differently. Birthdays were marked with absence. Holidays carried an empty chair. Grief settled into a constant companion, less sharp but no less present, a reminder that unresolved loss does not fade, it simply changes shape. Eleanor's sister kept her room as it was, a shrine of ordinary objects imbued with unbearable meaning, each one a question mark, each one a testament to a life interrupted without explanation. She learned the language of investigations, the acronyms, the procedures, because understanding felt like control, and control was the only thing left to grasp. In 2005, advances in forensic science breathed a little warmth into the cold, as police revisited old evidence with new tools, but the cupboard was bare, the case having been built on absence from the start, and technology cannot conjure what was never collected. Still, the review mattered because it said the case was not forgotten, that someone was still listening, still looking, even if the trail had long since gone dark. Officers walked the route again, older now, seeing it through a different lens, aware of how easily a moment can vanish if no one is watching. London moved on, as it always does, but somewhere beneath the noise, the case persisted, a quiet hum of unresolved tension, a reminder that some stories refuse to end neatly. The night Eleanor disappeared became a fixed point in time, replayed and re-examined, every second stretched and scrutinized, because if you look closely enough, surely something will give, surely a pattern will emerge. But patterns require data, and data was what this case lacked, leaving behind only speculation and the heavy knowledge that truth does not always rise to the surface on its own. Decades later, when people spoke of the case, they used words like legend and enigma, as if myth could soften the blow of reality. But for those who remembered, who had stood on that wet street and felt the first shock of not knowing, it was never abstract. It was a wound that refused to close, a question that echoed every time a bus pulled up to that stop and a passenger stepped down into the light. And somewhere in the city's vast, indifferent sprawl, the answer waited, buried under years of routine and forgetfulness, a truth that would one day claw its way back into the open, or remain forever just out of reach, leaving behind the unsettling certainty that some nights never really end. The years did not cool the questions so much as press it deeper into the fabric of the city, and when the case resurfaced it did so without ceremony, a file lifted from a shelf, a desk cleared, a detective lingering a second longer than usual over a name that had learned to survive on paper alone. It began with a review unit, the kind designed to find what earlier eyes could not, staffed by officers too young to remember the night itself and therefore unburdened by its assumptions, and that distance mattered, because familiarity can blind as easily as it guides. They read the statements again, not as artifacts but as voices, listening for rhythm, for hesitation, for the subtle tells that time sometimes reveals, and in doing so they noticed how often one name appeared at the margins, never central, never accused, always present, and yet never pinned down. He was a neighbor, or at least that was how he'd been categorized, a man who lived 2 streets over at the time, whose address placed him just close enough to be questioned, and just far enough to avoid suspicion, a quiet presence who had offered assistance when asked and then faded back into anonymity. His statement from 1979 was brief, unremarkable, the kind that reassures rather than alarms, but when read alongside later interviews, a discrepancy surfaced, small but stubborn, a shift in timeline measured in minutes, not hours, the sort of thing that might be chalked up to memory's erosion if it weren't for the fact that his recollection had grown sharper with age, not duller. That detail sat uneasily with the team, because memory tends to blur, not crystallize, and certainty after decades can be as telling as confusion. They pulled his name again, tracing it forward through the years, a slow crawl through public records that revealed a life lived without headline or scandal, jobs held and lost, addresses changed, a marriage that didn't last, no convictions, no obvious reason for interest. And yet the proximity nagged, the way he had been awake that night when others slept, the way his routine intersected with Eleanor's path at exactly the wrong moment. It was nothing concrete, nothing that would have justified action back then, But now the investigation had learned to value instinct sharpened by patience, and instinct whispered that this was a thread worth tugging. As they dug deeper, patterns began to flicker into view, not in what he had done, but in what he had avoided, a talent for staying just outside the frame, for offering information that closed doors rather than opened them. Interviews from the 80s and 90s showed a man practiced at sounding helpful, his answers smooth, unruffled, but lacking texture, as if rehearsed for a part he'd played too long. One detective noted how often he deflected questions with questions of his own, a conversational judo that kept focus away from him, a technique common among those who fear scrutiny. It was still circumstantial, still fragile, but circumstantial evidence is the soil where stronger proof sometimes grows. The review unit ordered a quiet re-interview, not as an accusation but as a courtesy, a chance to clarify, and when officers knocked on his door in the autumn of 2018, he greeted them with polite surprise, the kind that registers without reaching the eyes. Time had altered his appearance, thinned his hair, stooped his shoulders, but the voice matched the old recordings, steady and measured, and when asked about that night, he recited details with ease, too much ease, the scene unfolding in his words like a well-worn script. He spoke of the rain, the lamplight, the late hour, details that aligned neatly with reports, and then, without prompting, he corrected himself, adjusting the time he'd last been outside, a minor slip that might have gone unnoticed if the detectives weren't listening for it. They left without confrontation, without promises, but with a sense that something had shifted, because people rarely rewrite their own alibis unless they feel pressure, and pressure implies vulnerability. Back at the station, the team cross-referenced his statements with weather records, transport schedules, anything that could anchor the night in something objective, and in doing so they discovered an inconsistency that had lain dormant for decades, a bus route change that contradicted his account, placing him closer to Eleanor's stop than he had ever admitted. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was proof of presence, and presence matters. Attention turned to the handbag, the lone physical artifact of the crime, its discovery site mapped and remapped with modern software that revealed patterns earlier teams couldn't see, paths and distances recalculated with precision, suggesting that whoever discarded it had done so deliberately, choosing a spot accessible by foot within a narrow window of time. That window overlapped with the neighbor's routine, a late-night walk he'd mentioned casually in passing years ago, a habit that had never been examined because it seemed harmless. Habits, the detectives reminded themselves, are where opportunity hides. The team sought permission to re-examine items collected from his former residence during an unrelated investigation in the early 80s, objects long since cleared and returned, but traces linger, they always do, in archives, in storage logs, in the overlooked corners of bureaucratic memory. A coat surfaced, dark and heavy, once taken and dismissed, now subjected to testing methods unimaginable in 1979, and while it yielded no definitive link to Eleanor, it carried environmental traces consistent with the scrubland where the handbag had been found, a coincidence that stacked atop others until coincidence began to look like pattern. As whispers of renewed interest reached the family, the emotional temperature spiked, hope and fear colliding in equal measure, because reopening old wounds risks deepening them if nothing comes of it. Eleanor's sister was cautious, her optimism tempered by years of false leads, but she listened as detectives explained their approach, the care they were taking, the reason for their renewed focus, and in their restraint she sensed something different, something steadier than the bursts of attention she'd endured before. Still, she had learned not to believe in endings until they arrived, and even then, belief could be fragile. Behind the scenes, legal hurdles loomed, because suspicion is not enough, and the passage of time complicates everything. Memories degrade, evidence degrades, witnesses disappear, and defense arguments grow stronger with every unanswered year. Prosecutors were consulted early, their skepticism a necessary counterweight to investigative zeal, and they demanded more, something that could withstand scrutiny, something that transformed inference into inference backed by fact. The team went back again, not to the night itself, but to the months that followed, examining who had changed behavior, who had moved suddenly, who had liquidated possessions or altered routines, because guilt often reveals itself in aftermath rather than act. Financial records showed a withdrawal made by the neighbor days after Eleanor's disappearance, an amount insignificant on its own, but withdrawn at an hour that contradicted his claimed schedule, placing him awake and mobile when he insisted he'd been home. A former colleague recalled a sudden mood shift around that time, irritability replacing his usual reserve, a recollection offered hesitantly, because accusing a memory feels like a betrayal, but once spoken, it fit too well to ignore. Piece by piece, the case assembled itself not as a single revelation but as an accumulation, a weight that pressed harder with every addition. Surveillance of the present-day man revealed nothing dramatic, just a life pared down to essentials, routines that mirrored the past, solitary walks, late nights, a preference for anonymity, and that sameness unsettled the investigators, because it suggested a comfort with secrecy, a long practice at living alongside an unanswered question. When confronted again, this time with specifics, with timelines and records laid out like a map he could no longer avoid, his composure faltered, the measured cadence breaking just enough to expose strain. He denied involvement, denied knowledge, but denial had lost its power, because the investigation was no longer asking him to confess, it was asking him to explain, and explanations were proving elusive. The decision to move forward was not sudden, but when it came, it carried the gravity of 4 decades, a warrant signed with the understanding that history was watching, that the margin for error had long since evaporated. Officers rehearsed the arrest carefully, aware that this moment would reverberate beyond the man himself, through a family that had waited, through a community that had learned to live with uncertainty, through a system that rarely gets second chances. The morning was unremarkable, gray and cool, the kind that slips by unnoticed, and that felt appropriate, because crimes often hide in ordinary days, and justice, when it finally arrives, seldom announces itself with spectacle. As the handcuffs clicked closed, the past seemed to inhale, drawing in years of silence, and while the truth was not yet spoken, not yet tested in court, the shock had already begun to spread, a ripple through time that connected that wet street in 1979 to a quiet doorstep decades later. For Eleanor's family, the phone call came without preamble, a simple statement that carried the weight of everything they had endured, an arrest made, a name spoken aloud at last, and in that moment, relief and grief intertwined, because answers, when they come, do not erase loss, they only change its shape, leaving behind the daunting task of learning how to live with resolution after a lifetime of not knowing. The arrest did not end the waiting, it transformed it, turning decades of silence into a different kind of noise, the hum of speculation, the clatter of legal machinery grinding back to life, and for the first time since 1979, the case stopped being a story about absence and became a story about confrontation. Word moved fast, faster than anyone expected, slipping through newsrooms and onto front pages, the phrase "cold case" paired with a name at last, and the community reacted with a mix of disbelief and grim recognition, because people had learned to live with the mystery, to accept it as part of the neighborhood's folklore, and now that certainty was being challenged. Cameras gathered outside the suspect's home, lenses trained on a doorway that had opened and closed for decades without notice, and suddenly every movement felt loaded with meaning. Inside the interview room, the man who had once been a footnote faced a wall of time, his earlier statements laid out in chronological order, contradictions highlighted not to trap him but to show him the story he had told himself was no longer intact. Detectives spoke calmly, deliberately, aware that pressure could fracture cooperation, and they let the evidence speak in sequence: the bus schedules, the mapped routes, the financial anomalies, the environmental traces, each piece placed carefully, like stepping stones across a river he could no longer cross. He listened, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the table, and when he spoke, his words lacked the ease that had once protected him, explanations fraying as he tried to reconcile decades-old lies with present-day facts. For the prosecution, the challenge was monumental, because time is the defense's favorite ally, and 44 years had given it plenty to work with. Witnesses had died or moved beyond reach. Memories had softened at the edges. Evidence had been lost, degraded, or dismissed in an era when forensic expectations were different. Yet the case had one advantage it had never possessed before: context. Modern investigators understood patterns that had once been invisible: the behaviors of offenders who exploit routine, the psychology of proximity, the way ordinary familiarity can mask predation. That understanding threaded through their strategy, framing the suspect not as a monstrous anomaly, but as a man who blended seamlessly into his surroundings, a predator hiding in plain sight. Eleanor's family sat through briefings that felt unreal, the language of law replacing the language of loss, and each update carried both promise and threat, because progress meant exposure, and exposure meant reliving a night they had spent decades trying to survive. Her sister listened as timelines were reconstructed, as experts explained how opportunity aligned with motive, how the geography of the area made the crime possible without witnesses, and she found herself fighting an unexpected emotion, not relief, but anger. Anger that the truth had been so close, anger that it had taken a lifetime to reach it. Grief had taught her patience, but patience had not softened its edge. The suspect was charged, the announcement made in a courtroom, heavy with anticipation, and the words echoed, charged with significance, because charging someone in a case this old is an act of institutional faith, a declaration that the past can still be held to account. He pleaded not guilty, his voice steady, and the plea landed like a gauntlet thrown across the years, because it promised a trial that would drag every detail into the light. Journalists filled notebooks with shorthand and speculation, the story reframed once more, now less about mystery and more about reckoning, and the phrase, "arrest shocks victim's family," became a refrain, repeated until it lost specificity, but not impact. As preparations began, prosecutors faced the task of telling a story without relying on the one thing juries expect most in murder cases: a body. Eleanor had never been found, and absence, while emotionally powerful, is legally precarious. The strategy pivoted toward accumulation, toward showing that the absence itself was evidence, that Eleanor's life had been interrupted so completely that only an external act could explain it. Experts were brought in to testify about behavioral baselines, about how unlikely it was for someone with Eleanor's patterns to vanish voluntarily, about how disappearance without trace often signals foul play when coupled with abrupt cessation of activity. Each expert added a layer, reinforcing the idea that nothing about Eleanor's disappearance aligned with choice. The defense countered with doubt, highlighting the gaps, the years, the missing witnesses, suggesting alternative explanations that could not be disproven, because time had erased the means to do so. They questioned the reliability of newly interpreted evidence, argued that modern analysis imposed meaning where none existed before, and painted the investigation as an exercise in confirmation bias, driven by a desire for closure rather than truth. It was a familiar playbook, and one that resonated with the unsettling reality that certainty is harder to achieve when the past is incomplete. In that tension, the case found its pulse. Behind closed doors, the suspect's composure began to crack, not in dramatic confession but in subtle shifts, a willingness to speak that had not existed before, a request for clarification here, a correction there, small moves that suggested calculation rather than innocence. Detectives listened, documenting everything, aware that admissions often emerge not as declarations but as erosion, the slow wearing away of resistance. He spoke of loneliness, of nights spent walking to clear his head, of encounters that blurred together over time, and while he never named Eleanor, the shape of his narrative edged closer to her path, closer to that bus stop under orange light. Public reaction intensified as the trial date approached, old neighbors coming forward with memories they had once dismissed, stories that had seemed irrelevant until now: a van parked oddly, footsteps late at night, a man lingering longer than necessary. None of it was decisive alone, but together it painted a picture of a night that had not been as quiet as first believed. Each recollection was a reminder that silence can be communal, that what is not reported can be as influential as what is, and that fear of being wrong often outweighs fear of being silent. For Eleanor's sister, the days became a blur of preparation and dread, knowing that the courtroom would demand a composure she was not sure she possessed. She revisited memories she had sealed away, the last phone call, the last ordinary argument, the last promise to meet, because trials do not only examine evidence, they examine lives, and hers was about to be laid bare before strangers. She wondered whether justice, if it came, would feel like vindication or simply exhaustion, a closing chapter written so late it could not erase the preceding pages. As jury selection began, the case took on a new rhythm, governed by procedure and ritual, the slow, deliberate pace of law contrasting sharply with the suddenness of Eleanor's disappearance. Potential jurors listened as the outline was presented. A woman vanished, a community left in shock, an arrest made decades later, and each of them brought their own assumptions, their own relationship to time and trust into the room. The prosecution knew that persuading them would require clarity without oversimplification, honesty about uncertainty paired with conviction about conclusion. On the eve of opening statements, London felt poised between eras, the city that had swallowed Eleanor and the city now seeking to speak her name aloud in pursuit of accountability. The past hovered close, no longer distant but pressing in, demanding recognition, and for the first time in 44 years, the question that had haunted that wet street was being asked in a place designed to answer it. Whether the answer would satisfy was unknown, but the act of asking itself marked a shift, a refusal to let time be the final arbiter. In the quiet before proceedings, Eleanor's sister sat alone, holding on to the thought that whatever happened next would change the shape of her grief, that the long night of not knowing had given way to a dawn that was harsh and unforgiving, but real. Outside, reporters waited, their presence a reminder that this story had escaped the confines of private sorrow and entered the public record, where it would be dissected and debated. Inside, the machinery of justice prepared to turn, carrying with it the weight of decades and the fragile hope that truth, even delayed, could still speak loudly enough to be heard. The courtroom air felt heavier than it should have, a pressure built from years of silence, compressed into a single space, and when proceedings began, it was clear that this would not be a trial about a single night, so much as a lifetime of its consequences. The prosecution opened with restraint, aware that drama could backfire, and instead let the chronology unfold like a slow tightening knot, a woman of routine and predictability, a last bus ride, a short walk that never reached its destination. They spoke of Eleanor not as a symbol but as a person, grounding the case in her habits, her responsibilities, the anchors that made voluntary disappearance implausible, because juries respond to specificity, to the sense that a life has texture worth defending. Visual aids filled the screens, maps layered with timestamps, routes traced and retraced until the geography itself seemed to testify, and in those lines the prosecution argued opportunity, showing how the defendant's movements intersected with Eleanor's at a critical point. They highlighted the subtle shifts in his statements over decades, not accusing him of lies outright, but inviting jurors to notice the evolution, the way his memory sharpened in some areas and blurred in others, a pattern inconsistent with honest recall. It was a delicate balance, because memory is fallible, but inconsistency, when persistent and self-serving, carries weight. The defense responded by reframing the narrative, urging caution, reminding the jury that coincidence is not crime and that proximity alone does not equal guilt. They emphasized the absence of direct evidence, the missing body, the lack of forensic proof tying the defendant to Eleanor, and in doing so they appealed to a fundamental legal principle, that doubt must be resolved in favor of the accused. They warned against the seductive pull of a long unsolved case, the desire to close a painful chapter, arguing that such desire can distort interpretation, turning ordinary behaviors into sinister ones in hindsight. Witnesses took the stand in careful sequence, each adding a fragment to the mosaic. A former colleague described Eleanor's meticulous nature, her aversion to risk, reinforcing the portrait of a woman unlikely to vanish by choice. A bus driver, older now, recounted the brief interaction, The thank you that had lingered in his mind because it was unusual, a small courtesy that had taken on outsized meaning. His voice wavered as he spoke, aware that his memory, while sincere, was being weighed against the relentless erosion of time. Experts followed, their testimony technical but accessible, explaining how patterns of behavior can be predictive, how abrupt cessation across multiple domains of life often signals an external interruption. They spoke of offender typologies, of how crimes of opportunity frequently involve someone familiar with the environment, someone who knows when routines converge, and while they avoided explicit labels, the implication hovered, pointing subtly toward the defendant. The defense cross-examined vigorously, challenging assumptions, probing the limits of behavioral science, and reminding the jury that profiles describe populations, not individuals. The handbag became a focal point, its discovery site revisited in painstaking detail, forensic analysts explaining how modern techniques had identified environmental traces consistent with the area, how the manner of its disposal suggested deliberation rather than accident. The defense countered by questioning chain of custody, the potential for contamination, the dangers of applying contemporary interpretation to decades-old evidence, and the handbag, once a beacon of hope, became a battleground of expertise, its significance contested with each answer. When the defendant took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward, anticipation crackling, because this was the moment when theory met person, when abstraction gave way to flesh and voice. He spoke calmly, presenting himself as a man caught in a tragedy not of his making, someone whose life had been irrevocably altered by association rather than action. He acknowledged inconsistencies, attributing them to the fog of memory, to the pressure of repeated questioning, and his demeanor was steady enough to be convincing, at least on the surface. Cross-examination peeled back that surface layer by layer, not with aggression but with persistence, returning again and again to specific moments, specific claims, inviting him to reconcile them. Each correction, each clarification, added another line to the timeline, and in those adjustments, the prosecution sought to show a pattern of convenience, memory bending to fit necessity. The defendant bristled subtly, irritation breaking through composure, and in that shift, some jurors sensed strain, the effort of maintaining a narrative stretched thin. Outside the courtroom, the city watched, reactions divided, some convinced that justice was finally within reach, others uneasy at the prospect of conviction without a body, without the certainty many associate with closure. Talk radio dissected every development, social media amplified speculation, and the case became a mirror for broader anxieties about safety, trust, and the capacity of institutions to correct their own past failures. For those who had lived with the mystery, the noise was overwhelming, a reminder that private grief had become public discourse. Eleanor's sister sat through it all, her presence a quiet constant, absorbing testimony that oscillated between validation and doubt. She listened to strangers speak her sister's name, to parse her life into evidence, and felt the weight of representation, the fear that Eleanor might be reduced to a set of facts rather than remembered as a person. Yet she also recognized the necessity, the way law demands translation, turning emotion into argument, loss into proof. As the prosecution rested, they returned to the central theme, not a demand for certainty beyond all imagination, but beyond reasonable doubt, urging the jury to consider the totality, the way each piece reinforced the next. They argued that while no single element proved guilt, together they formed a coherent narrative that explained Eleanor's disappearance more convincingly than any alternative. The defense, in turn, prepared to dismantle that coherence, to isolate each piece and expose its weaknesses, because fragmentation is doubt's greatest ally. Days blurred together as testimony continued, the ritual of court imposing structure on a story defined by chaos, and as closing arguments approached, tension mounted, the outcome still uncertain. Jurors took notes, exchanged glances, weighed credibility, their deliberations foreshadowed in the set of their expressions. For the family, the waiting was almost unbearable, because this time, unlike all the others, there was an endpoint in sight, a verdict that would shape not only memory but the future. When the judge addressed the jury, outlining their task, the The language was precise, almost clinical, a necessary counterbalance to the emotional gravity of the case. They were reminded of the presumption of innocence, of the burden of proof, of the need to decide based on evidence rather than sympathy, and in that instruction lay the essence of justice, its insistence on discipline even in the face of tragedy. The jury filed out, carrying with them 44 years of unanswered questions, and the courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, the silence before a decision that would reverberate far beyond its walls. Deliberations unfolded behind closed doors, but their gravity seeped into every corner of the building, a palpable tension that pressed against the walls as if the past itself were pacing the halls. Jurors filed into the room carrying binders thick with notes, each page a fragment of a life interrupted and a system struggling to make sense of it decades later. They began methodically, electing a foreperson, reviewing instructions, grounding themselves in procedure, because order is the first defense against emotion, and emotion was everywhere in this case, coiled and waiting. They started with Eleanor, not as evidence but as a person, discussing her routines, her habits, the likelihood that she would abandon her life without a trace, and in that conversation a quiet consensus emerged that something had happened to her, that her disappearance was not voluntary. From there, the focus shifted to the defendant, his proximity, his statements, the slow accretion of inconsistencies that had defined the prosecution's narrative. Some jurors found the pattern compelling, others cautious, wary of reading intent into coincidence, and the room divided along that fault line, certainty on one side, skepticism on the other. The absence of a body loomed large, raised repeatedly as both obstacle and test, because without physical proof, everything rested on inference, and inference demands trust in the process, in the investigators, in the idea that justice can operate without tangible closure. Jurors debated the weight of expert testimony, the credibility of behavioral analysis, the relevance of modern techniques applied to old evidence, and in those debates, broader questions surfaced about the limits of knowledge, about how much uncertainty a verdict can carry and still be called just. Time itself became an unspoken juror, its influence felt in every discussion, because 44 years changes not only memories but standards, and some wondered whether the case would have been charged at all if it had occurred today. Others countered that progress in understanding does not invalidate the past, that new tools exist precisely to address old wrongs, and that refusing to act because of delay only rewards those who benefit from it. The argument circled, gaining intensity, because both positions carried moral weight. Outside, Eleanor's sister waited, her life once again reduced to hours marked by clocks and footsteps, each passing minute stretching thin. She tried to prepare herself for any outcome, rehearsing acceptance, rehearsing resilience, but preparation faltered under the strain of anticipation because this verdict mattered in a way nothing had before. For decades, uncertainty had been her constant companion, but certainty, she knew, could be just as disruptive, forcing her to confront a truth she had imagined but never faced. The jurors returned to the specifics, the bus stop, the lamppost, the mapped routes, the handbag in the scrubland, and in retracing those elements, they found that the narrative held together in a way that alternative explanations did not. No one could articulate a plausible scenario in which Eleanor vanished without encountering harm, and while the defendant's guilt could not be proven with the clarity of forensic science, the accumulation of circumstances formed a picture difficult to dismiss. Slowly, positions softened, skepticism giving way not to conviction but to reluctant agreement, the kind born of reasoning rather than emotion. Hours passed, then days, the rhythm of deliberation punctuated by requests for clarification, readbacks of testimony, the careful review of exhibits, and with each pass, the case narrowed, the space for doubt shrinking as jurors confronted the improbability of coincidence stacked upon coincidence. The standard was not certainty beyond all imagination, they reminded each other, but beyond reasonable doubt, and the reasonableness of doubt was the axis on which everything turned. When a consensus finally emerged, it did so quietly, without celebration, because verdicts in cases like this are heavy. Their weight felt most by those who deliver them. The foreperson filled out the form with deliberate care, aware that these marks would echo across decades, and when the jury filed back into the courtroom, the air shifted, anticipation sharpening into something almost physical. The defendant sat still, his expression unreadable, while Eleanor's sister gripped the edge of her seat, bracing for impact. The verdict was read aloud, the words measured and formal, cutting through the room with irreversible force, and as they landed, reactions fractured along predictable lines, relief mingling with shock, disbelief colliding with a grim sense of inevitability. For Eleanor's family, the sound carried both validation and sorrow, because confirmation of what they had long suspected did not bring joy, only a stark acknowledgement of loss. Tears flowed, not in release but in recognition, and understanding that the waiting was over, but the grieving was not. The defendant showed little outward response, a slight tightening of the jaw, the only visible sign that the years of evasion had reached an end, and as he was led away, the courtroom absorbed the finality of the moment. Justice, long delayed, had spoken, but its voice was subdued, aware of its own limitations, aware that no verdict could return Eleanor or erase the decades that followed her disappearance. Outside, reporters rushed to file stories, headlines forming even as the echo of the verdict lingered, and the phrase "cold case solved" took on new meaning, not as a celebration but as a reckoning. In the aftermath, Eleanor's sister spoke briefly, her words careful, measured, thanking those who had not forgotten, acknowledging the pain that remained, and in her composure lay the quiet strength of someone who had endured the unimaginable. She did not speak of closure, because closure implies an ending, and this story, she knew, would never truly end. Instead, she spoke of truth, of the importance of naming what had been done, and in that naming, she found a fragile sense of peace. As the courthouse emptied, London resumed its rhythm, buses rolling, footsteps echoing, ordinary life continuing in the shadow of extraordinary events. The lamppost still stood, the streets still glistened after rain, and the city carried on, but something had shifted, an old question answered at last, leaving behind a space where uncertainty once lived. The night Eleanor disappeared would never be reclaimed, but its grip on the present had loosened, allowing the future to unfold with a clarity hard-won and long overdue. Sentencing arrived without ceremony, a procedural endpoint that carried none of the emotional finality people imagine when they speak of justice, because justice, in practice, is measured and restrained, its language deliberately stripped of drama. The judge spoke of responsibility and consequence, of the gravity of a life taken and a family altered, and while the words were precise, they could not contain the decades that pressed against them. When the sentence was handed down, it landed heavily, not as triumph, but as confirmation, a line drawn beneath a question that had consumed nearly half a century. For Eleanor's sister, the moment was surreal, the culmination of a wait so long it had reshaped her sense of time. She listened as the judge recounted facts she knew by heart, each one a reminder that her private grief had been translated into public record, preserved now in transcripts and archives. There was relief, yes, but it was muted, complicated by the knowledge that the person responsible would age and die in custody while Eleanor remained frozen at 32, her life permanently paused in the public imagination. Justice had spoken, but it had not spoken in the language of healing. The convicted man was led away, his footsteps echoing briefly before fading, and with that sound, a chapter closed, though not cleanly. Outside the courthouse, reactions fractured along familiar lines, some voices praising the system's perseverance, others questioning whether certainty had truly been achieved. Talk shows debated the verdict late into the night, commentators parsing evidence, arguing philosophy, because cases like this invite broader reflection about memory, about proof, about the ethics of prosecuting the distant past. In those discussions, Eleanor's name became shorthand for an idea, a symbol of both failure and redemption, and symbolism, while powerful, can flatten the human cost. Investigators returned to their routines, the case file finally stamped with an outcome, but its weight lingered, a reminder that success measured in convictions does not erase the years lost to inaction or limitation. Some revisited their own careers, thinking of other files still gathering dust, other names waiting for attention, and in Eleanor's case they saw both a warning and a promise that patience and persistence can converge, but not always in time to soften the damage done. The review unit documented lessons learned, procedural shifts that might prevent similar delays, an institutional attempt to extract progress from pain. In the community where Eleanor had lived, the verdict stirred memories long buried, neighbors recalling their younger selves, the shock that had rippled through the street, the way doors had been locked a little earlier after that night. Some felt vindicated in suspicions they had never voiced, others unsettled by the realization that the threat had been familiar, someone woven into the fabric of daily life. The knowledge altered how people spoke of safety, of trust, because it underscored a truth often resisted, that danger does not always announce itself, that it can wear the face of normalcy. Media attention slowly shifted, the story yielding its place to newer crises, but the label "cold case solved" lingered, attached to Eleanor's name in databases and documentaries, a neat phrase that belied the messiness beneath. Filmmakers and writers sought access, eager to retell the story, to frame it with narrative clarity, and the family faced new decisions about participation, about boundaries, about how much of Eleanor's life they were willing to expose in pursuit of understanding. Each request reopened old wounds, forcing them to weigh the value of awareness against the cost of repetition. Privately, Eleanor's sister grappled with a different kind of silence, the quiet that follows resolution, when the constant hum of uncertainty disappears and leaves space that must be filled. For years, the case had given structure to her grief, a focus for anger and hope alike, and now that structure was gone, replaced by an open question of how to live without it. She visited Eleanor's grave, symbolic rather than literal, a place she had chosen to represent what could not be recovered, and there she spoke aloud for the first time since the verdict, words not meant for an audience, only for a sister who would never answer. Questions persisted, unavoidable and unresolved, about the exact sequence of events, about moments lost to time that would never be reconstructed, and while the law had reached its conclusion, the mind resisted closure, returning again and again to what-ifs and maybes. Investigators acknowledged this openly, conceding that certainty has gradations, that even the strongest cases leave room for doubt, and in that honesty lay a measure of integrity often absent from triumphant narratives. The truth, they said, had been established to the extent possible, and beyond that lay speculation, a territory best left unexplored. The case prompted renewed scrutiny of other long-unsolved disappearances, files reopened, families contacted, hope cautiously rekindled, and in that ripple effect, Eleanor's story achieved a form of legacy, its resolution a catalyst for action rather than an endpoint. Resources were allocated, review units expanded, and while no system can undo the past, there was a sense that lessons had been learned, that delay need not be destiny. For some families, that knowledge offered a fragile comfort, the idea that persistence might still be rewarded. As months passed, the intensity faded, replaced by a quieter reflection, the kind that settles in after shock has spent itself. Eleanor's name receded from headlines, but not from memory. Her story integrated into the broader tapestry of the city's history, a reminder of both vulnerability and endurance. The street where she disappeared looked no different, buses still stopping, passengers still stepping down into the glow of lamplight, unaware of the weight beneath their feet, and yet the place carried a new significance, marked by what had been acknowledged at last. In the end, the case did not offer redemption so much as recognition, an admission that wrong had been done and that it had mattered, even if the acknowledgement came too late to change outcomes. For Eleanor's family, that recognition was enough to shift the burden they had carried, not to set it down entirely, but to redistribute it, sharing it now with a system and a society that had finally named the truth. The night of her disappearance remained a scar, but scars, once recognized, tell a story of survival as much as of injury, and in that telling, a measure of peace, however incomplete, began to take shape. Time moved again, cautiously at first, as if unsure it had permission to resume its ordinary pace, and in that resumption the aftershocks of the verdict revealed themselves in quieter, more intimate ways. For Eleanor's family, life no longer revolved around court dates and updates, yet the absence remained, sharper in moments when the structure of the fight had fallen away. Friends expected relief, a visible easing, but grief does not obey expectations, and relief, when it came, arrived tangled with exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones after decades of vigilance. The battle had ended, but the cost of staying alert for so long now demanded to be paid. In private, Eleanor's sister confronted memories she had postponed, moments she had kept at bay because there had always been something more urgent to do, a petition to sign, a meeting to attend, a phone call to make. With the case resolved, those distractions evaporated, leaving behind the raw material of loss she had never fully processed. She found herself replaying ordinary scenes, Eleanor laughing at a joke half-finished, the sound of her footsteps in the hallway, details unconnected to the crime, yet now inseparable from its shadow. Justice had answered one question, but it had unlocked many others, questions about identity, about who she had become in the long orbit around a disappearance. The convicted man's name faded from conversation more quickly than Eleanor's had, an imbalance that felt both right and unsettling, because notoriety has a short shelf life, while absence endures. In prison records, he became a number, his story compressed into dates and classifications, and outside those walls, speculation about his motives dwindled as public attention shifted elsewhere. Some saw this as proof that the system had worked, that accountability had been delivered and could now recede, while others sensed a discomfort in how easily society moves on once a verdict is reached, as if resolution absolves the collective of further responsibility. Investigators reflected on that tension, aware that closure in law does not equate to closure in life. Some visited the old street again, not as officers, but as witnesses to a place that had shaped their careers, noting how unremarkable it looked, how resistant to meaning physical spaces can be. They spoke quietly about what had been missed in 1979, about the blind spots that came with limited resources and limited understanding, and while hindsight sharpened those conversations, they resisted the temptation to assign blame too freely, knowing that institutions evolve unevenly, learning sometimes only through failure. The case prompted internal reviews, not for spectacle but for reform, procedures adjusted to prioritize early preservation of evidence, training expanded to address disappearances with urgency rather than assumption, and while such changes offered no comfort to Eleanor, they represented an attempt to honor her indirectly, to ensure that her story would influence what came after. In meetings and manuals, her name appeared not as a headline but as a reference point, a reminder that delay can calcify into decades if left unchallenged. For the community, the verdict reopened conversations long avoided, neighbors speaking more freely about suspicions they had buried, about moments they had dismissed because they seemed too small, too speculative to matter. Those conversations carried a subtle admonition, a collective recognition that silence, even well-intentioned, can have consequences, and that vigilance is not paranoia but participation. Parents spoke to children differently now, less in terms of fear and more in terms of awareness, because the case had demonstrated how danger can exist alongside normality, unnoticed until it is too late. Media retrospectives revisited the story with a different tone, less sensational, more reflective, examining not just the crime but the conditions that allowed it to remain unresolved for so long. Commentators discussed the evolution of policing, the role of technology, the importance of review units, and in those analyses Eleanor's disappearance became a case study rather than a spectacle. Yet even in this more measured framing, the human cost remained at risk of abstraction, a challenge Eleanor's sister confronted whenever she was asked to participate, to speak, to lend her voice to panels and programs seeking authenticity. She chose selectively, learning to set boundaries where once she had said yes to everything, understanding that advocacy need not be endless to be meaningful. In those moments when she did speak, she emphasized not the drama of the arrest, but the endurance required to survive uncertainty, the quiet labor of waiting without answers, and her words resonated with others who recognized themselves in that experience. Support groups formed connections across cases and cities, families bound not by geography, but by the shared burden of unresolved loss, and in those connections, Eleanor's story found echoes that stretched far beyond London. The legal finality of the case also raised philosophical questions that lingered without resolution, about punishment and proportion, about whether a life sentence decades after the fact carries the same moral weight as one imposed swiftly, and about how societies measure accountability across time. These debates unfolded in academic journals and late-night discussions, rarely reaching consensus, because they touched on fundamental uncertainties about justice itself. Eleanor's case did not settle those questions, but it ensured they were asked with renewed urgency. As anniversaries passed, the date of Eleanor's disappearance began to feel different, no longer a marker of unanswered absence, but of a turning point, the night that defined both loss and eventual reckoning. Her family marked it quietly, choosing remembrance over ritual, and in that choice lay a shift, from seeking answers to preserving memory. Photographs once kept in drawers were displayed again, not as evidence, but as celebration, a reclamation of Eleanor's life from the narrow frame of her death. The city absorbed the story into its layered history, another thread woven into a tapestry already dense with past lives and past crimes, and while tourists walked unaware, those who knew carried a subtle awareness, a sense that beneath the everyday pulse of London lie countless stories, waiting to be acknowledged. Eleanor's was now one of them, no longer suspended in limbo, but anchored in truth, however imperfect that truth might be. In the quiet moments that followed, when the noise of debate and documentation subsided, what remained was a simple, enduring fact that a woman had lived, had mattered, and had been taken in a way that demanded recognition. The law had spoken, the city had listened, and time, for once, had not been allowed to erase the question entirely. What lingered was not satisfaction but a sober understanding that justice, when delayed, leaves scars even as it heals, and that those scars become part of the story, shaping how it is remembered long after the headlines have faded. The case did not truly end at sentencing. It diffused, seeping into places the law could not reach, into conversations, routines, and the private reckonings of people who had lived alongside the mystery for most of their lives. In the months that followed, Eleanor's name surfaced in unexpected contexts, in academic lectures about cold cases, in police training seminars, in documentaries that paused on grainy photographs and asked viewers to imagine a city less illuminated, less watched. Each retelling carried a responsibility, the risk of turning a human life into narrative shorthand, and with that risk came a renewed debate about how stories like hers should be told. Eleanor's sister felt that tension acutely, navigating a world suddenly interested in her family's pain, offered platforms and microphones in exchange for reflection. She declined many, sensing that repetition could flatten meaning, that too much exposure might reduce Eleanor to a symbol rather than preserve her as a person. When she did agree to speak, she insisted on details unrelated to the crime, anecdotes about Eleanor's humor, her stubbornness, her plans that never had the chance to become memories. In doing so, she pushed back against the gravitational pull of tragedy, asserting that a life cannot be summarized by its ending alone. Within policing circles, the case became a reference point for both pride and humility, cited as evidence that perseverance can overcome time, but also as a reminder of the cost of early missteps. Younger officers listened to veterans describe the limitations of the 70s, the absence of databases, the reliance on paper trails and human recall, and while those explanations contextualized failure, they did not excuse it. The lesson, repeated often, was urgency, the understanding that the first hours of a disappearance shape everything that follows, and that assumptions, however well-intentioned, can calcify into obstacles. That lesson reverberated beyond Eleanor's case, influencing how new disappearances were treated, with faster mobilization, broader canvassing, and a reluctance to categorize absence as voluntary without compelling evidence. Families noticed the difference, some finding solace in the idea that their loved ones' cases might benefit from progress born of past tragedy. In this way, Eleanor's disappearance, though singular in its pain, contributed to a collective recalibration, a subtle shift in how society responds to the vanishing of its members. Public memory proved less malleable, shaped by headlines and soundbites that favored resolution over complexity. The phrase "cold case solved" persisted, neat and reassuring, even as those closest to the truth knew how partial that solution was, how many questions remained unanswered. Where exactly had Eleanor been taken? How long had she lived after that night? What thoughts had crossed her mind in her final moments? These questions lingered beyond the reach of verdicts and sentences, reminders that truth has layers, some forever sealed. The absence of physical remains weighed heavily in this phase, resurfacing as a quiet ache now that legal processes had concluded. Without a body, rituals of mourning remained abstract, anchored in symbolism rather than certainty, and while the family had learned to live with that ambiguity, it never ceased to intrude. Eleanor's sister spoke of dreams where Eleanor appeared unchanged, unaware of time's passage, and waking from those dreams carried a peculiar disorientation, a sense that reality itself was less stable than memory. Scholars and commentators debated the ethical implications of delayed justice, questioning whether punishment imposed so late can fulfill its intended purposes: deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation. Some argued that accountability, regardless of timing, affirms social values, while others suggested that time erodes not only evidence, but moral clarity. Eleanor's case did not resolve those debates, but it grounded them, anchoring abstract arguments in lived experience, forcing theorists to confront the human cost of delay. The city's relationship to the story evolved, shifting from shock to assimilation, the case becoming one of many threads in London's long narrative of crime and consequence. Walking tours mentioned the disappearance in passing, a footnote in a landscape dense with history, and that casual inclusion unsettled those who remembered the rawness of the original loss. It was a reminder of how quickly extraordinary events can be absorbed into the ordinary, how memory fades even when answers finally arrive. Yet within certain circles, the case retained a sharper edge, among advocates for missing persons, among families still waiting, among investigators committed to reopening files others had abandoned. For them, Eleanor's story was not an ending but a tool, evidence that persistence matters, that silence is not destiny, and that truth, however delayed, can still surface. They referenced her name not as a symbol of tragedy alone, but as a benchmark, a reminder of what is possible when patience meets determination. Eleanor's sister found a fragile equilibrium in this new landscape, balancing remembrance with forward motion, allowing herself moments of lightness without guilt. She spoke of Eleanor in the present tense sometimes, not out of denial, but out of continuity, a way of keeping her integrated into daily life rather than confined to the past. Friends noticed the shift, the way grief had softened into something quieter, more reflective, and while it never disappeared, it no longer dominated every waking thought. As years accumulated beyond the verdict, the case's significance changed again, less urgent, more instructive, its emotional heat cooling into a steady glow of awareness. Eleanor's disappearance remained a cautionary tale, but it also became a testament to endurance, to the capacity of individuals and institutions to confront their own history. In that duality lay its lasting impact, not as a story of triumph, but as a reminder that justice is a process, imperfect and human, shaped by the same time it seeks to overcome. In the end, what endured was not the spectacle of arrest or the formality of sentencing, but the quiet persistence of memory, the refusal to let a life be reduced to a case number. Eleanor's story continued to be told, not always loudly, not always accurately, but with a growing awareness of its complexity, and in that telling, the city carried forward a lesson learned too late but not entirely lost, that the unanswered question is a burden shared, and that answering it, even decades on, changes not only the past but the way the future is imagined. Time does not close a cold case, it stretches it, pulls it thinner and thinner until the truth feels almost transparent, like something you could see through if you held it up to the light, And by the late 90s, the case had become exactly that. A shadow pinned to a corkboard, a name whispered with less certainty, a file box pulled down only when a new detective arrived and asked the same question everyone asked before. What did we miss? The city had changed its face by then. New glass buildings rising where old brick warehouses once stood, streets renamed, bars replaced by cafes. But the crime scene photographs did not age. The black and white images still sharp, still accusing. The body still lying at that impossible angle, the evidence still frozen in a moment that refused to move on. Detectives flipped through yellowing reports and heard the same phrases repeated like a broken chorus. No forced entry, no murder weapon, no credible suspect, no motive that fit cleanly enough to close the circle. Witnesses had scattered. Some moved away, some died, some claimed they remembered nothing at all, their memories eroded by decades of distance and denial, and the few who still talked did so cautiously, as if the case itself might overhear them and take offense. The original investigators were gone now, retired or buried, their handwritten notes preserved in folders that smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee, their instincts recorded but never confirmed, and the new generation approached the case with a different language, different tools, a quieter patience that replaced gut feeling with process. They digitized what they could, scanned photographs, transcribed interviews, fed fragments into databases that promised connections where none had been visible before, and still the case resisted, stubborn and mute. Every few years a tip would surface, a call from someone claiming they finally remembered something after all this time, a neighbor who swore they saw a man running, a former lover with a grudge, an anonymous letter written in block capitals, but each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Timelines didn't line up, descriptions contradicted each other, motives collapsed under the weight of reality. What haunted the detectives most was not what they knew, but what they could not explain, the strange absence at the center of the crime, the sense that something crucial had slipped through their fingers in the first chaotic hours and was now irretrievable. The victim's routine had been reconstructed 1,000 times, the final phone calls replayed, the last known movements traced on maps marked with red circles and arrows, and yet there was always a gap, a stretch of time no one could account for, a window just wide enough for the crime to occur and just narrow enough to conceal it. That gap became the case's signature, its defining feature, the black hole around which every theory orbited and eventually vanished. By the early 2000s, the case had officially entered the archive, not closed, not solved, but dormant, assigned a number and a shelf, revisited only when a journalist came calling or a true crime producer wanted to resurrect it for an anniversary piece. The victim's family learned to brace themselves for those moments, for the sudden return of cameras and microphones, for the familiar questions asked with fresh urgency, for the hope that flared and then dimmed again when the attention moved on. They had learned the language of uncertainty too, learned how to answer without promising themselves anything, how to grieve without an ending, how to live alongside a question that refused to be answered. And then, quietly, without press releases or headlines, the case stirred again. Not because of a witness or a confession, but because of a box. A simple cardboard box, mislabeled, misfiled, discovered during a routine audit of the evidence room when a technician noticed a discrepancy between an inventory list and the shelf in front of him. Inside were items that had not been examined in decades, sealed in plastic, tagged with dates that seemed almost unreal, a piece of clothing, a scrap of fabric, biological material collected before anyone truly understood what it might one day reveal. At the time, it had been cataloged and forgotten, another fragment in a case already drowning in fragments. The detectives handling the cold case now understood its potential immediately. Technology had changed the rules of the game, had given voices to evidence that once could only sit in silence, and what had been useless in 1987 was suddenly invaluable. The items were sent to a lab, handled with a reverence usually reserved for relics, because in a way, that's what they were, artifacts from a moment when the truth had slipped away. Weeks passed, then months, the kind of waiting that feels heavier because no one dares to speak about it out loud, because acknowledging hope makes its absence more painful if the results come back empty. While the lab worked, detectives went back to the beginning again, rereading old interviews with new eyes, not looking for answers this time, but for questions they hadn't thought to ask. They noticed inconsistencies they had once dismissed as human error, pauses in transcripts, answers that were technically true but carefully incomplete. They revisited alibis long accepted without challenge, mapping them against updated timelines, discovering overlaps that hadn't been obvious before. Nothing definitive emerged, but the shape of the case subtly shifted, as if the puzzle pieces had been rearranged on the table, waiting for one more piece to make sense. When the lab results finally arrived, they did not bring clarity, not yet. The profile extracted was partial, degraded by time, but it was something, a genetic whisper pulled from the past. It did not match anyone in existing criminal databases, no immediate hit, no dramatic reveal, just a confirmation that someone else had been there, someone who was not supposed to be there, someone whose presence had never been proven before. The case moved forward not with a leap, but with a step, small and cautious, because experience had taught everyone involved how fragile progress could be. The family was notified, carefully, gently, told that there was new activity, new testing, new possibilities, but no answers yet. They listened in silence, their reactions a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion, because hope, after all these years, was no longer a simple emotion. It was layered with fear, with the memory of previous false starts, with the knowledge that every step forward could still end in nothing. Still, they agreed to cooperate, to provide new samples, to answer the same questions again, because doing nothing felt worse. Outside the investigation, life continued, indifferent and relentless. The city buzzed, crimes came and went, headlines shifted daily, but inside a small group of offices, the cold case began to occupy space again, spreading across desks and computer screens, demanding attention, stealing hours from other work. Detectives spoke about it in lowered voices, aware of its reputation, aware of how many before them had believed they were close, only to be proven wrong. They reminded each other to be methodical, to resist narrative, to let evidence speak even if it whispered instead of shouted. And yet, something had changed. There was a sense, subtle but persistent, that the case was no longer static, that the past had finally loosened its grip just enough to allow a crack of light through. It was not resolution, not justice, not even certainty, but movement. And after decades of stillness, movement felt almost dangerous, like waking a sleeping thing that might not appreciate being disturbed. As the investigation pushed into its next phase, the detectives understood the risk as clearly as they understood the opportunity. Every new test, every re-examined lead carried the possibility of collapsing under scrutiny, of raising expectations only to dash them again, and yet stopping now felt impossible. The cold case had survived this long because it refused to die quietly, because it lingered in the background of every career, every briefing, every conversation about unsolved crimes, a reminder that some stories do not end when we want them to. Part 9 ends not with an answer, not with an arrest, but with attention stretched tight across time, the past pressing against the present, the evidence beginning to speak after years of silence, and a community once again holding its breath, wondering if this will finally be the moment when the truth steps out of the shadows, or just another chapter in a mystery that refuses to let go. The first real name surfaced without ceremony, not announced, not celebrated, just spoken once in a quiet office, as if saying it too loudly might cause it to disappear again. It came from a genealogical analyst halfway across the country, someone who did not know the victim, did not know the neighborhood, did not carry the emotional weight of the case, only patterns and probabilities arranged into fragile family trees. The partial DNA profile had been run through public databases, compared against distant relatives who had uploaded their information for reasons that had nothing to do with crime, curiosity, ancestry, the hope of understanding where they came from, and somewhere in those sprawling branches a cluster began to form, a convergence that pointed back toward a single line, then a single household, then a single man who had once lived close enough to matter. He was not on any original suspect list. He had never been interviewed. His name appeared nowhere in the old files except once, buried in a utility record attached to a neighboring address, meaningless at the time, overlooked because there was nothing to connect it to violence, to motive, to opportunity. In 1987, He was just another face in a crowded city, another life moving through the same streets as the victim without raising alarms. Now, decades later, he became something else entirely, a person of interest emerging from the margins, carried forward by science rather than suspicion. Detectives moved carefully, aware that this was the moment cases often unraveled. They verified timelines, confirmed addresses, traced employment records that still existed on microfilm, learned that the man had left the city not long after the murder, relocating, reinventing himself, building a life that appeared unremarkable, even stable. No violent convictions. No obvious red flags. The absence itself was unsettling because it fit too well with the idea of someone who had never been caught, never been forced to account for that night, someone who had learned early how to blend back into the ordinary world. Surveillance began quietly, legally, methodically. They watched him from a distance, observed routines that felt painfully normal, morning walks, grocery trips, conversations with neighbors who had no idea they lived beside a ghost from another era. The detectives struggled with the dissonance, the clash between the brutal scene burned into their memories and the man now smiling at strangers, because this was the cruelty of cold cases, the way time allowed potential perpetrators to age into something almost unrecognizable. The question was no longer just what happened, but who this person had become while the victim remained frozen in the moment of death. They needed confirmation, something definitive, something that would hold up under the harshest scrutiny, because decades of waiting demanded nothing less. An opportunity came unexpectedly, as it often does, when the suspect discarded a coffee cup in a public trash can, a small, careless act that felt insignificant to him and monumental to the people watching. The cup was collected, sealed, sent to the lab, and once again everyone waited, the same anxious silence, the same refusal to speak hope out loud. The result came back late on a Friday afternoon.
A match. Not partial this time.
Not ambiguous. A statistical certainty so overwhelming it left no room for interpretation. The DNA from the coffee cup aligned with the genetic material preserved from the crime scene, bridging a gap of more than 40 years with ruthless precision. The past had reached out and closed its hand around the present. In that instant, the case changed shape entirely, transforming from a mystery into a reckoning. An arrest warrant was prepared, reviewed, signed. Officers rehearsed the approach, mindful of the man's age, mindful of the optics, mindful of the reality that this would not look like the dramatic takedowns people imagined. It would be quiet, controlled, almost polite, because justice, after all this time, did not need spectacle. When they knocked on his door, he answered slowly, confusion flickering across his face, then something else, something harder to name, recognition perhaps, or resignation, or the sudden collapse of a lie held together for decades. The words were spoken calmly, deliberately. You are under arrest in connection with a homicide committed in 1987. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and allowed the handcuffs to be placed around wrists that had aged without consequence. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, sensing significance, without understanding it, witnessing the quiet removal of a man they thought they knew. News traveled fast and slow at the same time. The victim's family was notified before the headlines broke, given the courtesy of hearing it privately, the chance to react without cameras, without strangers interpreting their emotions. Some cried. Some went silent. Some felt nothing at all, because closure, when it finally arrives, rarely feels like relief. It feels complicated, heavy, almost unreal, as if the universe had corrected itself too late to matter in the way it once might have. As the story reached the public, it landed with force. A cold case solved. A suspect arrested after decades of freedom. Shock rippled through the community, through people who remembered the original crime, who remembered the fear it sparked, who had long ago accepted that it would never be answered. Questions flooded in. How could this have gone unsolved for so long? How many lives had unfolded in the shadow of that one act? How many moments had been stolen by waiting? Inside the interrogation room, the man sat across from detectives half his age, the weight of time pressing down on everyone involved. They asked questions carefully, aware that this was not just an interview but a collision between eras, between an old crime and a modern system finally equipped to confront it. He listened. He answered selectively, his voice steady, his expressions controlled, revealing little, as if the years had taught him how to keep the truth buried even when surrounded by it. Outside that room, the case file was no longer dormant. It pulsed with activity, motions filed, evidence organized, narratives constructed not for suspense but for court, for a jury, for a legal process that would now decide what decades of silence were worth. The cold case had reached a point of no return, and yet the emotional landscape remained unsettled, because an arrest does not rewrite history, it only acknowledges it. Part 10 closes with that uneasy reality, a suspect finally in custody, a mystery narrowed to a single life, and a community confronting the strange, sobering truth that justice delayed does not arrive cleanly or quietly. It arrives carrying the full weight of time, demanding to be reckoned with long after everyone involved has learned how to live without it. The courtroom felt smaller than anyone expected, compressed by years of anticipation, by the knowledge that this space would finally hold what the crime scene never could, an answer shaped by law rather than rumor. Wood benches creaked under the weight of observers who had grown old waiting for this day. Journalists leafed through notes thick with history, and at the center of it all sat the man whose name had once meant nothing, now heavy with implication. He looked diminished by the setting, thinner somehow, as if the decades he had outrun were finally catching up, settling into his posture, pulling his shoulders forward with a gravity that could no longer be ignored. The prosecution spoke in a language built on restraint, because spectacle was unnecessary when the timeline itself was shocking enough. They traced a line from 1979 to the present, from a violent act committed in an era of payphones and paper files to a modern courtroom illuminated by screens and digital exhibits. Evidence was presented slowly, deliberately, each piece placed where it belonged, the preserved biological material, the advancements that gave it meaning, the genetic bridge that spanned generations without mercy or sentiment. The story did not rush. It accumulated, sentence by sentence, until the gap that had once defined the case felt narrower, more contained, no longer infinite. The defense tried to introduce doubt where doubt had lived comfortably for decades. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Time corrupts certainty. They spoke of fairness, of the danger of judging the past with the tools of the present, of a man who had lived quietly for years without incident. But the argument struggled to gain traction because this case was no longer built on memory alone. It was built on material truth, on the kind of proof that does not forget, does not reinterpret itself, does not care how much time has passed. The victim's family listened from the front row, their faces a study in restraint and endurance. They had rehearsed this moment in their minds for years, imagined what it would feel like to hear the details confirmed, to watch the system finally engage with their loss, and still the reality refused to align with expectation. There was no catharsis in the recitation of facts, no relief in the confirmation of what they had always suspected but could never prove. There was only the strange stillness that comes when a question is answered too late to change anything that mattered. When the verdict was read, it landed without drama.
Guilty.
The word echoed briefly, then settled, absorbed by the walls, by the records, by the collective understanding that the long arc of the case had finally bent toward an ending. The sentence followed, measured, severe, acknowledging both the gravity of the crime and the years that had elapsed since it was committed. The man who had lived freely for decades was led away, not fighting, not protesting, his face unreadable, as if even now he was unwilling to offer the world anything more than compliance. Outside, cameras waited, eager for reaction, for statements that could be distilled into headlines, but the family declined. They stepped past microphones and questions, past strangers who felt entitled to their emotions, carrying with them something too complex to explain in sound bites. Closure, they would later say, was not a door that suddenly opened. It was a weight that shifted, a burden redistributed rather than removed. In the days that followed, the story rippled outward, discussed in offices and kitchens, analyzed on television panels, framed as a triumph of science, a victory for persistence, a warning to those who believe time erases accountability. Cold case solved, the headlines declared, and in a narrow, technical sense, they were right. A name had been attached to the crime. A verdict had been reached. The file had been closed. But beneath that declaration, something lingered. The understanding that no resolution can restore what was taken, that decades of waiting carve their own wounds, that justice, when delayed, arrives altered, imperfect, carrying consequences for everyone it touches. The community felt it too, the quiet realization that the streets they walked every day had once carried a secret powerful enough to endure for a lifetime. The detectives returned to their work, older now, marked by the case even as they prepared to move on. They spoke about it less frequently, not because it had lost significance, but because it had finally found its place in history rather than in limbo. The evidence was archived properly this time, the lessons noted, the knowledge that other cold cases waited, watching, patient and unforgiving. And so the story ends not with triumph, but with reflection. A life cut short. Another lived in borrowed time. A truth delayed but not denied. The cold case no longer a question, but a reminder that time can hide many things, but it does not forgive them, and that even after decades of silence, the past can still find a way to speak, demanding to be heard, no matter how long it takes. Even after the verdict, even after the file was stamped closed and shelved with a finality that felt almost ceremonial, the case refused to disappear. It lingered in quieter ways, in the pauses between conversations, in the questions people asked themselves when the headlines faded and life resumed its ordinary pace. Because a cold case does not truly end when a judge speaks, it ends slowly, unevenly, settling into the collective memory like a scar that never quite smooths over. In the neighborhood where it all began, the geography of the crime had been rewritten by time. Buildings replaced, streets repaved, entire blocks transformed into something unrecognizable. And yet for those who remembered, the past overlaid the present like a second map only they could see. They pointed without meaning to, here is where the siren stopped, there is where the tape once fluttered in the wind, that doorway where neighbors stood frozen, realizing something irreversible had happened among them. New residents walked those same sidewalks unaware, their lives untouched by the knowledge that history does not vanish, it simply becomes invisible. The victim's name returned to public consciousness briefly, spoken with solemn respect, attached to phrases like justice served and long-awaited closure. But names fade quickly once the moment passes, and the family understood this better than anyone. They carried the weight privately now, no longer propelled by the urgency of seeking answers, but faced instead with the quieter, harder work of integrating the truth into lives that had been shaped by not knowing. Some found themselves unexpectedly adrift, realizing that the pursuit of resolution had given structure to their grief, and without it, they had to learn a different way to live with loss. The man convicted became a subject of distant fascination, analyzed and categorized, his life dissected for signs that might explain how violence could coexist with apparent normalcy for so long. Commentators debated whether he had been hiding in plain sight or whether the world had simply not been looking closely enough. The question lingered uncomfortably because it suggested something deeply unsettling, that the boundary between the ordinary and the monstrous is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Within law enforcement, the case became a reference point, cited in trainings, mentioned in briefings, held up as proof of both failure and perseverance. It illustrated how easily crucial moments can be lost in the fog of an initial investigation, and how advances in science can resurrect truths thought forever buried. But it also served as a caution, a reminder that technology is not a cure-all, that behind every breakthrough lies years of waiting, of families aging, of lives unfolding under the shadow of unanswered questions. For the detectives most closely tied to the case, the ending brought an unexpected emptiness. They had lived with the file for so long that its absence felt strange, like a room suddenly cleared of furniture. They revisited it in memory, replayed decisions, wondered how different things might have been if one detail had been noticed sooner, one assumption challenged earlier. These thoughts had no practical value now, but they persisted anyway, because resolution does not erase responsibility, it sharpens it. And somewhere beneath all of this, beneath the verdict and the analysis and the quiet attempts to move forward, there remained a deeper unease. The knowledge that this case was not unique. That for every cold case solved decades later, countless others remained suspended in silence, waiting for a chance alignment of evidence and attention, waiting for someone to open the right box, ask the right question, refuse to let time have the final word. So the story does not conclude with celebration. It settles instead into a sober understanding. Justice arrived, but it arrived altered by delay. Truth emerged, but it emerged carrying the weight of years it could not give back. And the cold case, once a haunting unknown, became something else entirely, a testament to endurance, to loss, and to the unsettling reality that the past is never truly past. It is only waiting, patient and persistent, for the moment when it can no longer be ignored.